What if the solution to a multi-million-dollar warplane's fatal flaw wasn't in a high-tech lab, but in the greasy hands of a lone mechanic who decided the rulebook was wrong? Picture a sleek, twin-tailed fighter designed to dominate the sky, turning sluggish and dangerous above 20,000 feet. Pilots coming home in pieces while engineers argued over charts. Now picture a dusty North African airstrip, a staff sergeant with oil under his nails, and a lifetime of fixing things on faith, listening to those pilots, ignoring a "do not tamper" stamp, and betting everything on a single, unauthorized tweak. This is the story of that wrench, that gamble, and how it turned a liability into legend. The year is 1942. Over the bleached deserts of Tunisia, the air is hard and bright, and cutting that light is America's newest wonder, the Lockheed P38 Lightning twin engines, twin booms, a shape that looks borrowed from tomorrow. It was meant to dominate the sky. Long legs, heavy guns, the kind of aircraft engineers brag about. Pilots called it a marvel. On paper, it was unbeatable. But war has a way of testing blueprints. And in these sun-blasted fields, that perfect machine is about to reveal a flaw nobody at the factory quite expected. On the ground, the P-38 looked like a rocket, sleek, twin booms, twin engines built to rule the sky. But up where the air thinned and fights were decided, the Lightning betrayed that promise. It grew sluggish, vague on the controls, slow to respond. In the thin cold at 20,000 feet, it simply choked, unreliable, ponderous, a sitting duck. German Bf 109 seconds, lighter and ruthlessly nimble, would peel off in tight climbs and sail up and over, leaving American pilots scrambling and outrun, watching enemy fighters trade altitude for position while their magnificent plane wheezed behind. For American pilots escorting B-17 seconds, this isn't a technical quibble, it's a death sentence. They climb into thin air, expecting their Lightnings to pull them through, and instead watch power bleed away. Reports flood in from every theater. Above 20,000 feet, the engines gasp for air, sputtering as if someone choked the sky. Bombers are left exposed, formations vulnerable, buddies falling out of the sun. Radio chatter turns from tactics to pleas. Ground crews patch what they can, but patches don't fix a design that won't breathe. The Army Air Forces now face a clear, urgent crisis. The Army Air Forces know they have a crisis. The plane that was supposed to clear the skies is being outclassed, and the reports come in like a metronome of bad news: engines choking above 20,000 feet, escort fighters outclimbed and outmaneuvered. So, thousands of miles from the sand and gunfire, Wright Field springs into action the only way it knows how: slow, methodical, scientific. Engineers pull charts, run bench tests, argue over tolerances and margins, draft change orders and memos. It's careful work. It is also distant work. Meanwhile, the front lines don't have patience, only bodies and urgency, and that distance will matter. But on the front lines, time is measured in funerals. The answer isn't going to come from a laboratory. It's going to come from a dusty airfield in North Africa, where the sun bakes primer and sheet metal until rivets whimper and decisions can't wait for committee meetings back home. Mechanics count hours in sorties, not grant proposals. Pilots beg for fixes, not reports. Here, manuals are suggestions, and survival sharpens improvisation into invention. Grease-stained hands and stubborn common sense replace wind tunnels and blueprints. It's ugly, it's urgent, and it's exactly where the Lightning's salvation and the man who would risk everything to find it is about to be born. The solution, improbably, rests with an anonymous staff sergeant, a mechanic who trusted his hands more than any manual. Before the war, he'd turned wrenches in cramped auto shops, bargaining ingenuity for missing parts, jury-rigging fixes that actually worked. He wore grease like a second skin and had a knack for hearing engines the way others read maps. Not educated in wind tunnels or whiteboards, he understood machines by touch, by smell, by the stubborn rhythm of pistons. On a dusty North African field, away from right field's lab coats, he waits and listens, the kind of man who learns more from pilots' complaints than from blueprints. He listens to the pilots, one after another, each story a variation on the same sickening chorus. The Lightning is a beast on the runway, but a dog in the thin, cold air. They talk about 20,000 feet engines that cough, controls that go sluggish, men who come back with bullet holes and no answers. The ground crews shrug. The gauges read normal. The checklists are clean. But he hears the pattern the books miss. He hears fear in their voices, urgency in the cadence of reports, and slowly, a quiet, stubborn idea begins to form in his hands and behind his eyes. He sees what the engineers back home can't: the environment. Manuals and test charts were written in cool, controlled labs at sea level. They never imagined runways that felt like ovens, air so hot it robs radiators and intercoolers of any bite. In Tunisia, the Lightning wasn't dying from bad parts, it was obeying harsh physics nobody had bothered to simulate. That realization sharpens him. He stops trusting charts and starts trusting thermometers, squinting at oil and cylinder temps the pilots keep reporting. One component keeps showing up in every complaint, and he narrows his focus to it: the turbo supercharger. His focus narrows to a single unforgiving system: the turbo supercharger. It's the P38's oxygen pump, the thing that makes high-altitude flight possible by squeezing thin air into the engines. But compression has a price. Crushed air heats up fast. The intake charge can spike to around 300 degrees, turning what should be dense, power-rich air into a hot, weak breath. Hot air robs power and risks thermal damage. That's why intercoolers are chained into the system to bring that charge back down, and why the desert's searing ambient heat is about to expose a fatal weak link. Intercoolers are supposed to be the unsung heroes, cool the superheated turbo-compressed air before it hits the engine, make that intake charge denser, and give you more power when the air gets thin. In the lab that works on paper, colder, denser air means a bigger explosion in each cylinder and a plane that climbs. But out on a Tunisian runway, theory met reality. The desert air was already so hot that the intercoolers couldn't dump enough heat. The compressed charge stayed warm and thin. The result was predictable and brutal engines that lost their bite at altitude, and a mystery that would turn out to hinge on one tiny part. He traces the problem to one tiny, unassuming part: a thermostatic valve that opens and closes the intercooler's exit doors. On paper, it's genius, calibrated by engineers to prevent thermal shock, a conservative, by-the-book safeguard meant to protect delicate engines. But in the blistering North African heat, that careful calibration becomes a choke point. Instead of dumping cool air into the charge, the valve nudges the system shut when it's needed most, throttling the intercooler under load. A spring and a setting designed for safety are quietly turning high-altitude performance into a liability, and nobody back at the factory felt the consequences firsthand. In combat, SAFE was getting pilots killed. That little thermostatic valve, meant to prevent thermal shock in a calm factory test, ended up throttling the intercooler right when the turbochargers needed every scrap of cold air, starving the engines at altitude and turning the Lightning into a lumbering target. Pressure bled off, temperatures spiked, climb rate vanished, and German fighters that could still breathe at 25,000 feet rolled right over them. It wasn't just a design flaw, it was a bureaucratic caution written by men who weren't being shot at. On the line, the rulebook suddenly looked like a death sentence. Technical orders were clear. Do not tamper. The technical orders were carved in black ink. Do not tamper. Factory settings were scripture. In any sane manual, obedience kept machines reliable and paperwork clean, but the mechanic didn't read that kind of book. He read a different manual, the one written in the grim faces of pilots who climbed out of battered cockpits and told the same story, over and over. The Lightning choked at altitude. He'd seen the burned-out eyes, the hands that gripped the throttle like a promise. Rules meant safety on paper, not in a foxhole. So he started weighing lives against protocol, and the balance tilted toward action. He has an idea small, brutal, and perfectly illegal, dangerous enough to cost him his stripes. The rulebook says never touch the thermostatic valves. The pilots' graves say otherwise. What if you ignored the careful calibration? What if instead of nudging a spring, you ripped the governor off and forced the intercooler doors wide open, flooding the charge air with whatever the desert could give you? It's not theory anymore. It's a wager between procedure and people. He can hear the pilots in his head. He can hear the orders too. He chooses the pilots. And with that choice, the finish line between mechanic and saboteur narrows to a single wrench. He grabs a P38 down for routine maintenance and goes to work. At first, it looks like any service call, rags, oil, the familiar clink of tools. Then he traces the airflow to the spring-loaded intercooler exit doors. Without permission, without fanfare, he bypasses the thermostatic control wiring, springs, and all preparing to force the system wide open. With a few tools, he walked up to the P38, found the spring-loaded exit doors, and locked them wide open, maximum airflow, all the time. It was quick, crude, and a direct violation of every maintenance manual he'd ever been handed. He knew the risk. He also knew what those engines might do. There was more to come. He does something that would make an engineer's blood run cold. Grease-streaked fingers slip into the warm metal throat of the intercooler, feeling for the thin plates that tame the airflow. With a grunt and a twist, he rips them free. Metal clatters, ductwork yawns open, sacrificing neatness for raw volume. It's brutal. It's intentional. He isn't after even air. He wants a flood. His goal wasn't even. It was overwhelming. He didn't want delicate balance. He wanted maximum airflow. All the time. It was a crude, unauthorized hack, the mechanical equivalent of taking the governor off a race car engine. He knew it broke every manual and flirted with disaster, but he truly believed the engines could take it, so he prepped the Lightning for a test. It's a bitter February morning in 1943, and a young lieutenant, already patched and patched again from 2 scrapes with death, straps in with a mouthful of doubt and a pocket full of hope. He's got nothing to lose. The twin engines stutter, then settle into a steady growl. The mechanic stands by, hands stained, watching like a father holding his breath. He taxis, opens up, and the P-38 lifts off into thin blue. This flight will prove whether a stubborn field fix can beat a factory's caution. He climbs, wheels up, and the desert falling away. At 5,000 feet, the engine temps read normal. At 10,000, still steady. He keeps pushing, past 15,000 feet, the thin air line where Lightnings used to cough and die, yet the nose keeps rising, the needles calm, and for a terrifying, thrilling second, the whole flight line holds its breath as he reaches for the cockpit gauges. He glances at his gauges, and the numbers don't lie. Cylinder head temperatures sit about 20 degrees cooler than a standard P-38, a clear, stubborn green on the dials. For a long, awful second, the field feels like it might be holding its breath. The mechanic's gut instinct, the greasy-handed gamble, is actually working. Still, This is war, not a wind tunnel. The engineer's worst fears, thermal shock, stressed metal, a surprise blowout hang in the air like smoke. The pilot lets that knowledge sit for one heartbeat, then nudges the stick. They need to know if this miracle will endure. At 20,000 feet, the altitude that used to choke a Lightning, this P38 keeps pulling. The lieutenant grins, even if he won't say it out loud. He pushes to 25,000, then 28,000 feet, eyes glued to the gauges, heart suddenly light. No sputter, no heat spike, just steady, hungry power, climbing as if it had found a second wind. The engines weren't just running, they were singing. He keyed the radio, voice cracking like a man who couldn't quite believe his own ears. She's climbing. Numbers didn't need time to prove it. The altimeter jumped, the needle biting hard, and the climb rate felt as if someone had bolted 1,000 extra horses to each engine. Airframe settled, but the acceleration kept coming. Instruments, once stubborn, suddenly obeyed. Heat gauges stayed calm. For a breathless moment, the sky seemed to lean in, listening. Then, through static, the pilot laughed, half prayer, half profanity, and the ground crews below began to stand straighter. He taxis in to a knot of anxious ground crew, cuts the engines, climbs out with oil on his hands and a grin so wide it looks like defiance. Then, soft as a prayer and loud enough for everyone to hear, he says 6 words that change everything. She climbs like a homesick angel. For a beat, there's stunned silence, then whoops and slaps on the back. Faces that had been carved thin with worry finally loosen. Men whisper the phrase into radios, into bottle green logbooks, into the ears of the man who made it happen, and the mechanic, eyes sharp, immediately starts pulling plugs and checking for the thermal damage the engineers feared. He dives in like a man who knows what to look for, fingers greasy, flashlights slicing through oil and dust, pulling spark plugs one by one, wrenching cylinders cold to the touch, running compression tests, peering for cracked pistons or warped valves, hunting the little scars thermal shock would leave. Every check comes back the same. No glazing, no detonation marks, no melted metal. The readings are steady. The plugs look normal. The engines hum contentedly, as if nothing radical had been done. For a moment, the airfield is stunned into quiet. His risky tweak hadn't burned the heart out of the Lightning. It had simply made it breathe. It boiled down to plain thermodynamics. Cooler, denser air carries more oxygen into each cylinder. More oxygen equals a richer charge, which means a bigger, cleaner combustion. Bigger combustion isn't poetry, it's raw horsepower. By forcing more cool air through the intercoolers, the mechanic had shifted the engine's whole operating point. Cylinder head temps dropped, mixture stayed healthy, and the superchargers could actually do what they were designed for at altitude. No exotic tech, no secret fuel. Just colder air and better breathing, which translated directly into the climb and speed the pilots had been begging for. The pilots finally had the horses they needed. It didn't arrive with a press release or a ribbon-cutting, just word of mouth in the heat and grease of a desert strip. One crew chief showed another. A pilot came back grinning, and the next ground crew copied what they'd seen. It spread like grease on a wrench. Fast, quiet, practical. No one signed a waiver. No headquarters memo cleared it. It was a whisper campaign, a chain of small, bold choices, locked open doors, ripped out baffles made by people who measured risk in lives, not regulations, and who knew the difference between theory and what actually flew. Within days, the fix was everywhere, a whispered tweak turned into a ritual in every oily hangar. P38 seconds walking out with their intercoolers locked wide and baffles gone. Crews swapped wrenches like contraband, pilots flew grinning, and losses started to drop. The squadron commander watched the rulebook and the return manifests. He could have clamped down, penned formal reprimands, and waited for right field to catch up. Instead, he did the only thing that mattered in a war zone. He chose victory over paperwork and quietly let his boys keep the edge. He files a terse, by the book report up the chain paperwork that says what he did and why, then walks back to the flight line and lets the work continue. He doesn't ground the birds. He doesn't handcuff his crews with a signature. It was a quiet rebellion, not defiance for glory, but a bet on instinct over ink, on grease-stained hands over a manual written an ocean away. He knows the risks, an angry memo, a reprimand, a court-martial whisper, but he also knows what happens when pilots climb and die. So he trusts his men, trusts the data they bring down in sweat and oil, and buys them a few more flights while the big machines back home get up to speed. Meanwhile, at right field, engineers ran the slow clock precise, obsessed with proofs. In labs and wind tunnels, they recreated the Lightning's woes on paper in charts, running formal tests, writing procedures, and arguing tolerances. Their solution would be tidy, a factory kit, stamped and bolted, complete with blueprints and change orders. It was brilliant, necessary, and it would take months to design, validate, and authorize. By the time signatures cleared desks and crates rolled out of the plant, the desert mechanics and their pilots would already have improvised an answer, and the frontline squadrons would either be saved or gone. By the time the bureaucracy finally wakes up, the war has moved on. Frontline commanders have watched the numbers faster climbs, fewer lost bombers, and they refuse to wait for paper. Quiet orders ripple through the theaters, retrofit every Lightning. What started as a rogue mechanics hack becomes frontline doctrine almost overnight. The Luftwaffe, smug and surprised, is about to face a very different animal. April 1943, over the Mediterranean, a flight of field-modified P38 seconds springs a trap. They rocket to altitude so fast, the German escorts are flat-footed. Before the enemy can react, the Lightnings are on them. A furious burst of guns, chaotic maneuvers, and 3 enemy planes go down. The Luftwaffe never saw it coming. A month later, a modified P-38 meets a Bf 109 inches. The cold blew its pilot, a seasoned German ace. He grins, yanks the nose up into his signature vertical climb, betting the Lightning will stall and die under him. The P-38's pilot muscles the stick, stomps the throttles, and for one tense heartbeat, everyone on the ground waits to see if the field fix was brave luck or real magic. Instead of folding, the modified P-38 simply refuses to quit. It climbs with the German, sticks to his six like glue, matching him foot for foot, hanging on the propeller arc before whipping over and sending the ace tumbling toward the desert. The pilot and ground crew watch, stunned, and the gun camera rolls. Black and white, unmistakable proof that the Lightning's tweak just turned the tables. The numbers tell the story. Between March and June 1943, squadrons flying those field-modified P-38 seconds recorded a staggering 42% drop in losses on high-altitude missions, almost half fewer pilots and planes shredded out of the sky. That kind of statistic doesn't live in reports. It lives in returned crews and full bunks, in bomber formations that suddenly reached their targets and came home. It validated the savage little tweak made in a desert shop, turned whispered field fixes into frontline doctrine, and set the stage for a new reality over the clouds. They weren't just surviving anymore. The result wasn't subtle. Those gains on paper became control in the sky, and control changes everything. Squadrons that had been desperate now chose their battles. Formations climbed faster, held tighter, and pushed deeper. German pilots who once shrugged at the Lightning found themselves recalculating tactics on the fly, giving the fork-tailed devil a grudging, wary respect they hadn't bothered to afford before. Radio chatter turned from curses to cautious praise. Morale shifted as quickly as altitude charts. American crews flew bolder, escorts arrived sooner, and the enemy learned that meeting a P-38 meant meeting a plane that would no longer be outclimbed or outclassed. For American pilots, the change was immediate and electric. They christened it the White Lightning Upgrade, a dirty little tweak that turned a lumbering escort into something razor-sharp. Men who'd spent missions praying for altitude came back grinning, and one pilot summed it up simply: flying a stock P-38 after the mod was like driving a truck after getting out of a sports car. Climb rates jumped, throttle response felt keener, and caution gave way to confidence. Crews flew higher, engaged earlier, and started dictating the terms of the fight. The buzz spread along flight lines and across radios until, inevitably, the factory could no longer ignore it. In June 1943, a team of Lockheed engineers lands in North Africa to inspect one of the field-modified P-38 seconds. The factory has come to confront the field. Clean-cut men with clipboards step into dust and heat, expecting shortcuts and sloppy workmanship. The squadron's grease-blackened mechanics fold their arms, ready to defend what they've done. The modified Lightning taxis up, its engines humming with a confidence the manuals didn't predict, and for a charged moment theory and practice stand face to face as the factory men reach for the cowling. They walk the perimeter, hands on rivets, faces tight. They look at the bypassed valves and ripped out baffles. By their standards, it is butchery, a blunt hack that tears up a designer's intent. It violates a dozen design protocols, the sort of careful rules that keep engines predictable and factory lawyers happy. And yet, the instruments whisper something else. Climb charts that spike, temperatures that stay stubbornly calm, throttle response that shouldn't exist. The engineers who came to scold now find themselves arguing with numbers. The data is irrefutable. They can scoff all they want, they'll have to test it. Their own tests couldn't argue. A clean, brutal number, 12% more power at 25,000 feet, and engine temperatures holding steady, no mysterious blowouts, no melted pistons. The field crews had, with a handful of wrenches and a stubborn refusal to accept by the book, improved a multi-million-dollar design. 12% isn't a rounding error up there, it's climb rate, it's acceleration out of a dive, it's life or death for a bomber escort. Engineers stared at the data, the same way the pilots had stared at the sky, stunned and, for the first time, a little humbled. Humbled, Lockheed went back to the drawing board, not in anger, but in a quiet, begrudging respect. Field data and gun camera proof had forced their hand. The desert crews hadn't broken the plane, they had improved it. By August 1943, that lesson rolled off the factory floor as the P-38J, now with a completely redesigned intercooler system that borrowed the mechanics' brutal simplicity. Engineers smoothed and refined what the grease-stained hands had invented, turning a handmade bypass into standard hardware. It was validation writ in metal, a reminder that genius sometimes lives in dusty workshops and that a stubborn wrench can change the course of a war. The later P-38 leaders perfected that field, fixed the open intercooler, the ripped baffles turning a greasy, improvised salvation into cold, stamped factory metal. What started as a wrench, a gamble, and a handful of mechanics on a dusty North African ramp was rewritten into blueprints, test criteria, and production runs. The mechanics' crude courage became engineering spec. The whispered modification became standard procedure. On assembly lines, the Lightning learned to breathe at altitude. That grassroots tweak didn't just survive scrutiny, it was elevated, standardized, and spread. So every new Lightning rolled off the line already carrying the desert's hard-won advantage. The fix didn't just save a plane, it rewrote how fights were fought in thin air. Suddenly, the P-38 wasn't a quirky twin-boom experiment, it was the go-to high-altitude escort, taking on long-range bomber protection and interception missions commanders had once handed to the heavier P-47. Squadrons reshuffled tactics overnight: climb fast, control the vertical, and force the enemy into a fight on American terms. Pilots who'd once cursed the Lightning now trusted it with their lives. Enemy escorts learned to give it respect. What started as a greasy, improvised tweak became doctrine and practice, showing up not just over Tunisia, but soon over New Guinea as well. Over the jungles and cloud tops of New Guinea, Major Thomas Lynch put that extra climb to brutal use. He yanked the Lightning up like a shot, punched through enemy formations, and turned what had been a desperate chase into a sudden ambush. One moment, the Japanese fighters thought they had the angle. The next, they were spilling away in smoke and fire as Lynch's guns chewed through their wings. It wasn't theater, it was life or death. Those quick, unexpected victories kept escorted bombers intact and crews alive. The tactical edge was no longer theory. It was real, and it was saving men. By late 1943, the statistics were staggering. Squadrons that had barely made it to altitude were suddenly writing a different story. When bomber formations flew with the field-modified P-38 seconds, enemy aircraft destroyed jumped by 57%. It wasn't abstract. Pilots came back with gun camera proof, maintenance crews logged fewer emergency climbs, and commanders rewrote tactics on the fly. Short climbs became steep climbs. Hesitation became aggression. That 57% leap was more than a bragging point. It was a blunt measure of air superiority regained, a metric that translated directly into fewer desperate meetings and, as the next numbers would show, more crews making it home. Numbers are one thing, but the human math is what really matters. A 31% drop in bomber losses didn't just improve charts. It meant dozens more crews stepping off a plane and back into the arms of waiting wives, parents, and children. It meant fewer telegrams, fewer funerals, fewer empty chairs at kitchen tables. Whole towns breathed easier. Squadrons stopped counting bodies and started counting reunions. Confidence spread from the flight line into the cockpits, into the mess halls, into letters home that now began with relief instead of grief. That shift from dread to hope would change how those men flew and how they lived. Pilot morale soars. They now have unshakable confidence in their machines. They can take the fight to the enemy, knowing their plane won't fail them when it matters most. Suddenly, climb rates that once felt like a mechanical lottery become predictable power. Bomber captains stop biting their nails as escort squadrons slice through cold air and meet interceptors on equal terms. That calm, quiet, fierce changes how missions are flown. Bolder climbs, tighter formations, fewer anxious calls for help. Crews come home more often. Letters stop beginning with dread and start arriving with relief. With faith in metal and mechanic, pilots fly not just to survive, but to win. The P-38 Lightning finishes the war not as an also-ran, but as a legend, sharp, unmistakable, flown by America's top aces. It even helped change history. A squadron of Lightnings intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Gun camera footage and dispatches turned the fork-tailed devil into an instant symbol of American air power. That notoriety came from more than machine design and daring pilots. It came from countless missions, hard lessons, and the improvised fixes on dusty runways. In the end, the P-38's legend is metal and myth, but also the product of human courage and quiet ingenuity. That legacy belongs to its brilliant designers and brave pilots. But it also belongs to the mechanic who made it possible, a grease-streaked staff sergeant with more faith in his hands than in a manual, who ripped out a baffle, locked a valve, and gambled with a multi-million-dollar airplane because lives were on the line. He didn't write the blueprints, he didn't fly the missions, he stayed on the dusty ramp, watching gauges and men climb and come back, and in those quiet returns he knew his gamble paid off. No plaques would list him. Still, every saved crew carried his quiet victory into the war. He never stood on a podium, no ribbon, no brass ceremony. The staff sergeant who tore open the P-38's guts, who ignored a manual because lives were on the line, vanished into the daily noise of the flight line grease under his nails, sand in his boots, the same quiet hands that fixed destiny. History kept the names of aces and engineers. It chewed up the anonymous wrench turners and spat them out. No headline ever bore his name. No historian knocked on his door. What he got instead was something quieter and harder to tally on a report. He got no parade, no medal, nothing but the sight of more patched-up P-38 seconds rolling back onto the field with pilots clambering out, slapping a wrench arm on the mechanic's shoulder, a nod that said more than any citation. His recognition wasn't brass on a chest, but the steady, quiet confidence in the men's eyes, the way they trusted their machines and climbed into the sky a little less afraid. That was enough. Watching a bomber come home, whole, hearing a pilot joke about the angel mod, those were the medals he wore, invisible, but heavier than any ribbon. But his fingerprints are all over aviation history, a grease-streaked proof that sometimes the loudest lessons come from the quietest places. A single field tweak turned a temperamental machine into a lethal advantage, and in doing so it forced engineers to listen to the people who lived with the airplanes every day. It wasn't glamour or a patent, it was practical wisdom, real air, real heat, real combat. That lived experience exposed a blind spot in theory and rewrote assumptions in the hangars and boardrooms. In short, a wrench and common sense closed the gap between paper and battle, and the lessons would follow the next generation of fighters. When Lockheed designed America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, the specs quietly carried a new clause: provisions for maximum intercooler airflow under combat conditions. It was not a line born in a lab, but one seeded in the desert, an admission that war throws at machines things no wind tunnel can perfectly mimic. Engineers built in bigger ducts, simpler valves, and tolerances that favored raw cooling over cautious conservatism, because a nameless mechanic had shown that keeping charge air cold could mean the difference between life and death. In other words, a rough, unauthorized field fix didn't just save missions, it rewired how designers thought about combat aircraft from that moment on. That lesson didn't come from calculus or a wind tunnel, it came from a wrench, oil-stained hands, and nights on a desert airstrip listening to pilots swear the Lightning wouldn't climb. He'd never seen a wind tunnel, but he understood density, heat, and the brutal physics of combat, the kind of math you learn when planes are getting shot at and people die. His crude, dangerous bypass proved lived experience could trump neat theory, and engineers would later bake that fix into new designs. In short, some solutions are discovered where the war is fought, not where the tests are run. Peacetime tests can't simulate the full chaos of war. That's where the gap appears, the gap between what the manual says and what actually works when people are shooting at you. Wind tunnel numbers and cautious thermostats were written for predictability, not for gun smoke dust-choked runways, and pilots begging for a few extra inches of climb. On a sun-blasted strip, theory meets teeth. Margins vanish, and improvisation becomes survival. That is why a grease-stained staff sergeant trusted his ears and guts over a drawing board. Why a stripped baffle could mean the difference between a homecoming and a funeral, because combat reveals what tests never could. It's in that gap that heroes like him are forged, quietly, without fanfare, changing the world with a wrench and an idea. Not in laboratories, but under hangar lights, where heat, bullets, and deadlines force practical truths out of theory. He gambled on common sense over a manual, risked court-martial for a tweak that put men back in the sky. No ceremonies followed, only fewer funerals and pilots who trusted their machines again. Those small, stubborn fixes ripple outward. They become policy, doctrine, and eventually the programs that try to capture the field's brutal wisdom and feed it back into the system. The Air Force and industry didn't just pat themselves on the back and move on. They tried to bottle that gritty genius. Innovation offices, rapid fielding teams, and formal channels were stood up to harvest the little fixes born on flight lines. Ways to send a tip from a mechanic's wrench to an engineer's drawing board, fast-track prototypes back to squadrons, and turn whispers into official kits instead of waiting years for paperwork. Bureaucracy learned to listen, to codify what worked and make it safe at scale. Still, those programs only succeed when they pay attention to the people with grease under their nails. Even today, after countless programs, briefings, and formal channels meant to capture frontline genius, the spark usually ignites where the rubber meets the runway hands, stained with oil, eyes that have watched one gauge 1,000 times, minds that hear problems the schematics miss. These are quick thinkers who turn observation into a one-night prototype, who trade diagrams for gut calls and field tests, who learn faster than any committee. Bureaucracy can package and scale their fixes, but it rarely invents them. More often than not, the breakthrough comes from someone who knows the machine by touch and won't wait for permission when lives hang in the balance. History isn't written by committees. It's written by someone willing to break the rules when people are bleeding. In a desert airfield, a wrench in calloused hands mattered more than 1,000-page manual. He didn't have time for studies or signatures. He had pilots coming back in pieces and a simple, dangerous idea. Bypass the thermostat, open the intercooler, let the engines breathe. That courage to try a fix, not in the book born of urgency, not ego, closed the gap between lab theory and life or death reality. The military would later formalize the lesson, but the first proof came on a climb home, proven in blood and survival rather than charts. The mechanic's innovation wasn't written in blueprints. It was proven in blood and survival. He looked at an engine that wasn't giving its best and decided the manual wasn't the final word. He trusted calluses and instinct more than a spec sheet, reached into hot ducts, and chose results over rules, a small, stubborn act of defiance with pilots' lives on the line. It was risky, dirty, and utterly unglamorous, but it worked. Planes climbed higher, crews came home, and whispers of the tweak spread faster than any memo. That quiet, desperate courage would become the kind of lesson no desk-bound engineer could ignore. His story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound changes don't come from the top down. They don't arrive in a neat stack of blueprints or a committee memo. They arrive in the grime under a mechanic's nails, in a hurried phone call between shifts, in a stubborn refusal to accept that's how it's done. One wrench, one risky tweak, one field test at sunrise can rewrite doctrine and save lives. It's a small, stubborn kind of courage, practical, invisible, terrifying to bureaucracy. And it's exactly the kind of thing that spreads quietly across flight lines and eventually forces the factory to listen. Real innovation rarely rides in on a parade. It creeps in on grease-stained overalls and the stubborn certainty of someone who's seen a problem up close. These ideas come from the bottom up, from the quiet genius hidden in plain sight on dusty flight lines, in cramped hangars, at midnight over a wrecked manifold. It's the mechanic who trusts his hands more than a manual, the crew chief who risks a reprimand because men's lives depend on it, the small, brave adjustments that no boardroom ever imagined. Those unheralded choices tip the balance of battle, and they deserve more than silence. They deserve to be remembered. In the end, the only recognition that truly mattered wasn't a medal pinned to a chest or a name in a ledger. It was the men who walked off the bombers and went home to their families, because one mechanic refused to let a manual decide fate, because one wrench in a dusty field changed the odds of survival. Those quiet, greasy hands rewrote a chapter of aviation with improvisation and courage. Tell that story. Share it. Because honoring the nameless heroes who tinkered, tested, and risked everything isn't nostalgia. It's remembering that real innovation often comes from the people closest to the problem.